It's the 6th of April, and welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research here in Singapore. I'm Taimur Baig, Chief Economist. So far in this podcast series, we have restricted ourselves to the geography of Singapore and sitting down with our guests face to face. But given the times we live in, it is high time to go remote, and that frees up geographical barriers and our guest pool considerably. In fact, we will connect with New York City right now, where in the east side of Manhattan is our guest for today. We are very pleased to have on our show Dr. Bernard Haykel, Professor of Near Eastern Studies and Director, Institute for Trans-Regional Study of the Contemporary Middle East at Princeton University. On leave from the university this year, Professor Haykel is working on a book on the political and cultural history of Saudi Arabia. Given what's been going on with the oil market and simmering tension in the Middle East, we're fortunate to have somebody like him on our show and dip into his extensive experience and expertise in this area. Professor Haykel, welcome to our show. And before we discuss oil and the Mideast, please give us a sense of your day-to-day life in New York, which appears to be the current eye of the COVID-19 storm.
Thank you. Thank you, Taimur. It's a pleasure to be here. Being in New York, it is strange because the streets are largely empty. You occasionally hear an ambulance go by. On the east side, I'm close to some of the biggest hospitals in the city, so quite a few ambulances are going by here. And at 7 p.m. every evening, people go out on their balconies or out their windows and start applauding and whistling. This is a gesture of thanks for the doctors and nurses and medical staff that are dealing with this pandemic here in New York. And I basically stay at home and avoid going out, except perhaps once a week to buy perishable items, food items. But I have stocked up the non-perishable ones and can basically, eat rice and lentils for 2 months if I have to.
Indeed, good to hear that. And our thoughts and sincere prayers are with your family and near ones, and of course with the victims of this pandemic worldwide. Bernie, I'd like to begin by talking about this fantastic article you recently wrote in Project Syndicate, provocatively titled Saudi Arabia's New Radical Oil Strategy. Tell us why you think Saudi Arabia's momentous decision on the March 7th to step up oil production unilaterally and begin discounting the price of crude oil was not just to punish Russia or U.S. shale producers, but it seems to me, reading your article, you think that there might be some bigger strategy in place.
I do. And the reason I do is because Saudi oil in particular, but Gulf oil, oil in the Persian Gulf region more generally, it has certain comparative advantages over other oil in the rest of the world, namely that it's some of the cheapest oil in the world to produce and to bring to market. And if you look at the energy market and oil and gas market, you see that much more expensive oil, more expensive to produce, has been taking up more market share in the global energy mix than that of the Gulf. And as American shale in particular has expanded, and America has become number one producer of oil in the world, Saudi oil and other Gulf oil has had to lose market share to American oil. And that, to me, strikes me as unsustainable and doesn't make much economic sense, in particular when countries like Saudi Arabia are actually trying to wean themselves off of oil and to diversify their economies. So they have an incentive to produce and to monetize their oil as quickly as possible, especially if this transition to decarbonization takes place. And so my sense is that the Saudis are very much in favor of trying to get rid of as much of their oil as possible, as quickly as possible, before it becomes a stranded asset. And this is based also on a series of conversations that I've had with various Saudi scholars and politicians, as well as the leadership in Saudi Arabia. And so based on that, I felt it was good to situate what was happening in a broader context, in a broader kind of structural context of energy markets and oil markets.
Very interesting indeed. Help us contextualize this further if you can, because we've seen series of tweets from Donald Trump in recent days that a 10 to 15 million barrel production cut is in the horizon, and that has led to actually a fairly sharp rally in oil prices in the last few days. Later this week, an OPEC Plus meeting is scheduled, where it is hoped that a deal can be reached to cut the global supply of crude. The meeting was, of course, originally planned for today, but has been pushed back. Tell us what's going on.
It's a very, very complicated story, frankly, in that you have three principal actors in this drama. You have Saudi Arabia, you have Russia, and you have the United States. And the Saudis basically would like to stop losing market share to more expensive oil, as I said, and to maintain market share in order to generate revenue, since oil is in fact, the major source of government revenue for Saudi Arabia. And Saudi has this massive, like other Gulf states, has this massive fiscal expenditure to its population, because 70% of the working population in Saudi Arabia works in the government, works for the government. And so half the budget goes to paying salaries. And that's an extremely important element in the political structure and the maintaining of social order and peace in a country like Saudi Arabia. So the Saudi view is, we're the cheapest producer. We want to sell more, and we want to maintain a high enough price to be able to balance our budget. Their break-even price, which is the price they need to balance their budget, is over $80. The other actor in this drama is Russia. Russia has a lower break-even price of around $40 or so. It also is upset by the larger role that American oil has played in the market, and the fact that America has eaten into market share. Their producers, lower cost producers, but also Russia has a view that the United States is a dominant hegemon, that is a bully, and that has imposed sanctions on the Putin regime, and it wants those sanctions removed. So it's using its oil policy to engage politically with the United States as well as economically. And then, as far as the U.S. is concerned, the third actor in this drama, well, here you have a very complicated set of issues. First, there is no centralized form of production in the United States. Every producer can produce as much as they want. The government can't impose limits on production. You have independents and majors, so smaller producers, bigger producers, and they're divided on how they see the oil market. And then you have President Trump, who is conflicted, or at least ambivalent, about whether he wants a low oil price, which is what he says he wants, because that's helping the U.S. economy recover after the pandemic, versus protecting this expensive oil industry that requires very high levels of very high price in order to be economically successful. And so you have these three actors, and they all seem to want a deal, but one in which no one actor makes all the compromises and does most of the cutting. And that's what's being demanded of Saudi Arabia, essentially, is that of cutting the most of its production in order to keep supply limited or more limited in order to boost the price. And that's what the Saudis are balking against. Now, behind all of this is a radical development in the global economy because of the pandemic, which is that we're seeing demand destruction of anywhere between 20 and 30% of global for global oil, which means, about 30 million barrels. So the world consumes 100 million barrels a day, roughly speaking, and we're seeing between 20 and 30 million barrels of less demand as a result of the pandemic.
So this, of course, makes life very difficult all over the Middle East, including some close allies of Saudi Arabia. I would think that Abu Dhabi would not be happy with this crash in oil prices. I'm not really sure whether I can classify Iraq as an ally of Saudi Arabia, but we're seeing serious tension there as well because of the economic collapse. How does Mohammed bin Salman balance all these conflicting imperatives?
Well, I think no oil producer is happy about the present situation, where you have overproduction, you have a major oversupply of the market or supply overhang, and demand destruction. I think Mohammed bin Salman, when he looks at this landscape, his concern is first and foremost for his own country, before that of any Iraq or what happens in Nigeria, what happens in Venezuela or the United States. So he needs to be able to pay salaries. He needs to also tell the Russians and the Americans that he won't, if they don't share the burden of cutting production, he's not going to do it on his own. And the UAE, for instance, Abu Dhabi in particular, which is the major emirate with oil production in the United Arab Emirates, has tried to reconcile the conflict with the Russians over production cuts, but at the same time has said, they will increase their production in keeping with Saudi Arabia's policy of flooding the market. So they've tried to play it both ways, try to be conciliators, but at the same time allies of the kingdom. And I guess, please.
And I was just going to say that, speaking of allies, I wanted to hear a little more from you about the state of Saudi-U.S. relationship. Saudi buys a lot of American arms, supports the U.S. as well as Israeli foreign policy objectives of confronting Iran and supporting Egypt. And the U.S. has been fairly quiet about the Qatar blockade, the war in Yemen, the Khashoggi assassination, and even more shockingly, during the oil price, as you said rightly, there hasn't been that much criticism from Donald Trump about the Saudi oil strategy. So, what is binding the White House with MBS so tightly?
Right. So, in fact, President Trump hasn't blamed either the Saudis or the Russians, for that matter. He's just saying that it's the reason for the dramatic decline in oil prices is the virus pandemic. And now, as far as Saudi Arabia and the United States are concerned, Saudi Arabia has essentially always wanted to have a strong personal relationship with the President of the United States. And Saudi Arabia, unlike, for instance, Israel, doesn't have a domestic American constituency that supports it. You have the military and producers of weapons, as well as oil companies that have generally been pro-Saudi in the United States, but they don't have a strong political voice when it comes to voting and deploying and mobilizing people in favor of Saudi Arabia. So it's always been a relationship with the executive branch of government. It's particularly strong with Trump because Trump likes how the Saudi crown prince and king have handled him, have managed him. They treat him like a member of royalty. It was the first country that he visited after becoming president, and they really laid out the red carpet for him. And he's very transactional as a president. So he sees Saudi Arabia as a major purchaser of American weapons, therefore a source of jobs in the United States. And I think President Trump in particular came to political and economic consciousness in the 1970s. It was a major player. And individual Saudis were really the biggest tycoons in the world. You can think of Adnan Khashoggi, for instance, in the 70s and 80s, who was an arms dealer at the time. And Trump bought Khashoggi's yacht. For him, the Saudis have always been sort of a paragon of wealth and influence. And then there may be personal relationships there to do with business between them, but that's very difficult to prove and to substantiate. So on the whole, the Saudis have not had a strong American constituency in the American public. They've pretty much lost the Democratic Party entirely and have become a highly partisan issue in American politics. There are some Republicans who support Saudi Arabia, but even now we see that all the senators from the oil-producing states have written letters about Saudi Arabia's role in this oil spat with the Russians, basically condemning Saudi Arabia and threatening sanctions against Saudi Arabia. These are a group of Republican senators in the U.S. Congress from countries like Alaska, from states like Alaska and Texas. So the Saudis have always had to depend on the White House, and this is just a more accentuated version of this policy.
Highly accentuated, absolutely. Bernie, you earlier were talking about how UAE, particularly Abu Dhabi, is trying to keep both the Russians and the Saudis happy. Are they also trying to play a role of peacemaker between Saudi Arabia and Qatar?
No. No, actually, the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Qatar is also very much a conflict between the UAE and Qatar. There's a long history of antagonism between the UAE and Qatar. In fact, the antagonism between Qatar and the UAE is much stronger than that between Saudi and Qatar. It's a long historical conflict over tribal and territorial issues. And so if there is going to be a breakthrough in the clash between Qatar and Saudi and the UAE, it's more likely to happen with Saudi and not with the UAE. That's just a small element of the dynamic that most people are not aware of, which is that it is principally the UAE that is anti-Qatar, not Saudi Arabia.
Well, I certainly was not aware of that, so thanks very much for that clarification. So what is the end game? How long will this go on, which I'm sure it has hurt the UAE economy because Qatar had to divest in a large quantity from UAE. I'm sure it doesn't help Saudi Arabia either. And it's gotten in the way of flights through the region. There was a lot of economic prosperity that was being spread. Now, at a time when the world economy is in such dire straits, keeping these things going will only make a really, really bad situation even worse. Do you see any stars aligning for some sort of a detente?
If there is going to be a detente, it would be about the 2022 football World Cup, which is being hosted by Qatar. So the UAE and Saudi are saying, let's share some of that so that some of the events actually happen in Saudi and the UAE. But ultimately, the clash is really about very different political visions for the entire region. So the Qataris are committed to, for instance, being strong allies of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Islamist political movement, whereas the UAE is adamantly against Islamists everywhere. So there's a kind of very different view of the future of the region and who the main actors should be between these different countries, between the UAE and Saudi on the one hand, and Qatar on the other. So I think, and it's driven by personalities as well. So the individuals on whether it's MBS in Saudi or Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE versus the Emir and the Emir father and in Qatar, those are highly charged, personalized rivalries. And I think unless the individuals leave or a new leadership emerges, this conflict is going to go away. And one of the reasons it's also not going to go away is that these countries, especially the UAE and Qatar, are so rich that they can afford to maintain this rivalry. They can sort of, as it were, pay extra for maintaining it. And I think that's not likely to change anytime soon.
Indeed. I'm going to switch track a little bit and talk about the other really intriguing relationship in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Israel. They have a common enemy in Iran. But are there broader strategic issues that has brought Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been beleaguered for a while but seems to be getting hold of power again for at least another year or so in Israel and MBS?
So I think, the question of Israel and specifically of Palestinian rights is one that in Saudi Arabia is still quite important among the population. So a lot of the Saudi public cares about the Palestinians, and that will always constrain the Saudi leadership vis-a-vis Israel. I don't think, for instance, that the Saudis will ever reach out to the Israelis and make peace without some deal that is ultimately acceptable to the Palestinians, simply because domestically within Saudi Arabia, it remains unacceptable to make peace without taking into account Palestinian rights. So there are strategic interests between the two countries, namely the clash with Iran, that is keeping them together. The fact that they're both strong allies of the United States, and in particular President Trump, that brings them together. And then there is, I think, admiration for the economic and technological prowess of Israel in the Saudi leadership. So the Saudi leadership, in particular MBS, when he thinks of the kind of economy he would like his own country to have, he wants to diversify, as I said earlier, his economy. He sees the Israeli economy as a model. A kind of technological powerhouse, a military industrial powerhouse. So that's the kind of economy, that's the kind of society at the economic, industrial, and technological levels that he would like to have himself in his own country.
It's absolutely intriguing. We've spent quite a bit of time talking about Saudi Arabia. I want to talk about a couple of other countries in the Middle East who also have important dynamism vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, but probably more with respect to the US, starting with Iraq, where, of course, the year began with a big bombshell with the assassination of General Soleimani. We have seen simmering tensions continuing with between the US forces or allied forces and Iranian proxies on Iraq. And I've also read some reports recently that the US soldiers have sort of moved back a bit and sort of soft withdrawal is continuing. But more troublingly, and I want you to shed light on this, that I've been reading reports of a big preparation by the Americans to take some serious military action against Iranian proxies on Iraqi land. Can you give us some insights as to what's going on?
Yeah, I think that Iraq is, if there's an economy in the Middle East, aside from Iran, and of course also Syria, which is devastated, but Iraq is in very dire straits because you have deep political divisions within the society. You have a leadership that is highly fragmented. You have some Iraqis who are beholden to the Iranians, others who are very much against the Iranians in terms of political alliances. And you have this crashing price of oil. And again, Iraq is a country that requires oil revenues in order to pay its public sector, in order to maintain social peace. And that is all fraying at the moment. So the country is fraying politically as well as economically. And so it's likely that unless a political solution, is found for Iraq, we will see a lot more tension, a lot more upheaval in the country. Leaving aside the presence of the United States, there are internal Iraqi dynamics that I think are very serious and very destabilizing for the country. As far as the United States is concerned, it has a military presence in Iraq, and that military presence is ostensibly there to fight the Islamic State, to fight terrorism, to support also the Kurds in the north, where the bulk of the U.S. presence is, and also to train the Iraqi army. And what the U.S. is at the moment saying, and particularly President Trump is saying, is that that Iran has proxies in Iraq, and those proxies are targeting U.S. troops. So this ongoing war or tension with the Iranians is being played out through proxies in Iraq, and that the U.S. would retaliate against these Iranian proxies if U.S. troops are targeted. So it is a flashpoint where you could eventually see a serious clash between the United States and Iran taking place, beginning with Iraq, but then eventually potentially extending to other countries. Sorry, I have Siri that's just come on. for some reason.
That's okay. In this world of remote interviewing and talking, I think we all have to be ready for little interruptions here and there. No worries at all.
Yeah.
Bernie, on the issue of Iran, the country was at the eye of the storm a few weeks ago, seems to be, at least not from official accounts, be somewhat successful in dealing with the COVID-19 outbreak recently. But of course, as you correctly said, just like Iraq, it's economically devastated because of years of sanction. I'm pretty sure the Americans are not interested in loosening up sanctions against the Iranians at this juncture, even on a humanitarian basis. But can you see some sort of an effort by the Europeans and the Chinese to push for more humanitarian assistance and maybe even some things that are beyond the, or that sort of leads to some sort of a easing of sanctions?
So I do know that the Europeans and the Chinese are helping the Iranians, but the extent of the devastation because of the virus in Iran is not clear. It seems like it's actually hit the leadership of the country, because we see that a number of high-ranking officials have died as a result of the COVID-19 virus. I don't see an easing of American sanctions against Iran, and the way in which American sanctions work is that any company or country that deals with Iran opens itself up to potential sanctions from the United States. So let's say you're a French company, you want to do business in Iran, or even you're trying to help Iran in this moment of crisis. If you have business in the United States, that can be jeopardized because of your dealings with Iran. And so that means that you have this extraterritorial reach of America that is preventing companies and countries from dealing with Iran because they fear American sanctions. And that's not likely to change at all, not least because the two principal allies of the United States in the region, namely Israel and Saudi Arabia, are very much in favor of maintaining these sanctions, and in fact may even want the United States to engage militarily against Iran. They would like to see the regime toppled, and would love to see the United States be the principal agent for that to happen. I don't think the U.S. Will go to war against Iran, and I don't think the regime will topple. This is a very powerful regime in Tehran, and one that still maintains a level of legitimacy and support among the Iranian population, so that it's very hard to see it coming apart or breaking down, either for internal reasons or for external ones.
Correct. Is Iran just biding time and hoping and praying that a Democrat becomes president of the United States in November and sanctions will get eased at that point?
I think so, yes, because a number of Democrats and in particular officials who worked previously in the Obama administration have basically sent that message to the Iranians, saying, just bide your time. Once a Democrat comes into the Oval Office, things will change, and we will be able to resume the agreement, the JCPOA agreement, which is a nuclear agreement, and sanctions will be lifted. Although, I mean, that is a major gamble, because I'm not certain that a Democrat will win in November, the presidential elections. That's one. And two, the Iranian regime is under severe restraints and able to wait till November for that to happen.
If the IMF or the World Bank were to offer Iran a financial assistance program, do you think the U.S. would sort of veto it and stop it from happening, or these are?
Yes, and in fact, it has. The Iranian government asked the IMF for a $5 billion loan, and the U.S. blocked it.
So even COVID-19 is not going to change that?
No, I think what the Americans have said to the Iranians is that they're willing to provide humanitarian assistance. The Iranians rejected that offer, and then the Iranians asked the IMF for a loan, and that was turned down by the United States. That was blocked by the United States.
So we're not going to see much respite there.
No.
Bernie, I want to go further west from Iran, all the way to the Mediterranean, to the country that you grew up in. Lebanon. Um, Always political intrigue in place, but also always on teetering on the brink of financial collapse. What's the latest there? And are there regional implications for security if Lebanon were to become destabilized?
Yeah, so in Lebanon, what you essentially have is a complete financial meltdown. The banking sector, which had been resilient throughout the Civil War and for several decades after the end of the Civil War in 1990, finally has collapsed. And that collapse is due to a couple of things. Mainly, the remittances from overseas have stopped. A lot of Lebanese are in the diaspora. They send their remittances back to Lebanon. And also, Gulf countries have historically helped the Lebanese state by offering loans and grants and so on. Those have also stopped. So the Lebanese banking sector, which essentially took these remittances and these foreign, these hard currency inflows, lent them to the government by buying government bonds. The government would promise a high rate of return. So the banks were essentially lending to the government, and the depositors were making a reasonable return on their money, largely because of this government, these government bonds. There was an element of a Ponzi scheme here, in that remittances were constantly going into the banking sector and then being lent to the government, and the government was promising to pay back a very good return. As a result, government debt has increased tremendously, and Lebanon is one of the highest debt to GDP ratios of any country in the world. I think it's like number 3 or 4. This, of course, may now change with COVID-19, but essentially that whole system broke down. And that breakdown is also a function of the political breakdown in the country, and the fact that the country was ruled by a group of politicians who were quite corrupt and themselves. So all of that happened in the fall of last year, in October, November, and the country has not revived at all. And now with the pandemic hitting the country, you have an even greater burden on the government, and a complete a cessation of economic activity in the country, plus no remittances coming in as well. So I expect a country like Lebanon to become, to lose a very significant amount of wealth, to see the poverty rate increase, to something like 50%, where a bulk of the population, maybe even a majority, will live under the poverty line. So you're seeing the pauperization of the country. And that will eventually lead to all kinds of domestic instability, a breakdown in law and order, but also to the large number of refugees trying to get out of the country. So Lebanon has over 1 million Syrian refugees. They will have to try to find a place to go to. So you're going to get more pressure towards Europe, I think, refugee pressure from Lebanon, and you will have a breakdown in law and order domestically. This is it's also important to highlight that in Lebanon, you have a highly militarized population. A lot of people have guns. So once real poverty, where people don't have enough to buy food, once that really strikes, I think you will see a lot of criminality emerging as well. So it's a very bleak scenario.
Right, and we haven't even talked about the strongest Iranian proxy of all, Hezbollah, sitting in Lebanon, and what happens to them if their source of earning dries up, and how they sustain themselves.
Yeah, I mean, Hezbollah has used a lot of the remittances from Shiites over the Lebanese in diaspora who are Shiites. Hezbollah is a Shiite political group. It has used Iranian support from Iran. And has used the Lebanese state as a cash cow as well. And all of that is drying up. So what Hezbollah will do, I mean, a lot of people assume that once that happened, Hezbollah would launch a war, would try to agitate against Israel in order to attract attention to the plight of the Lebanese and maybe even funding. I don't think that's likely to happen. I think Hezbollah, along with other Lebanese political forces, finds itself in dire straits and will look to protect its political base of supporters as much as it can. But it is going to suffer, and its supporters are going to suffer like the rest of the Lebanese population is going to as well.
I just realized that we have been talking for well over half an hour, and there's so much left. Syria, Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, Afghanistan. Bernie, we have to have you back another day to get a more comprehensive view. But I thank you very, very much for your time and your insights. We're very grateful. Thanks to our listeners for joining us. You have been listening to Kopi Time with Taimur Baig. Thank you.
Thank you.